Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 3 of Introduction to Human Geography by Dorrell and Henderson. This is a chapter focused on human migration, which is a fascinating topic. I have to confess that this chapter was written a little awkwardly for me, so I took a little longer than I wanted to in getting through it and coming up with a presentation for it, but here it is. I will be skipping over a little bit of the chapter if you are following along with the book and you wanted the lecture to correspond one-on-one with the chapter. You're going to miss out a little bit here. I apologize for that, but some of this stuff, the way it was written, is a little bit, it's drier than burnt toast 3 days old. So I'm going to skip over, for instance, this definitions and data section. Let's talk though about why geography is why migration is a important subject for geography and geographers to study, and in fact why it's got a lot of connections to a lot of other elements of geography. First of all, humans are animals that move and move great distances at times. So the human race or species has been moving around the planet now for thousands and thousands of years. That's interesting in itself. That's continuing today. So this is not a new thing. In fact, it's part of one of our most fundamental characteristics as the animals that we are, as we tend to move and explore, and that's part of our past. This has happened historically tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago in terms of major migrations out of Africa and across the entire planet. And it happened later with the missionary journeys of major religions, world religions. It's happened due to conquering armies. It's happened due to colonization of territories. It's happened from lots of different cultures moving for lots of different reasons. The other reason we're really interested in understanding the geography of migration is because when we understand why people move and how they have moved in the past, we can make better sense of present day distributions of geographic features. Things like where languages are spoken, where languages are not spoken, where religions are practiced or not. And so the distribution of a lot of modern cultural features depends on the historic migration of people bringing that culture with them or transmitting that culture as they moved. Hopefully that motivates our interest in the chapter a little bit, so you are excited to get through the next section, which is about the data and data sources and definitions. Here's a really quick map from Wikipedia of some of these massive migrations across the planet. Not all of these dates are certain. People are putting their best estimates in here, but we have lots of evidence that people have moved around the planet, obviously, because there are lots of anthropological remains in a lot of these places. So let's move on to the definitions and data section. I'm not going to go into this in detail. As I said, it's pretty dry, but I want to talk really quickly about a big idea in geography, which is the idea of net migration. Almost every place has people both moving into it and moving out. Some places have more people moving in than out, in which case there are more immigrants than emigrants. And we have a positive net migration, also known as net in migration. Then if you have more people moving out, that is emigrants than immigrants, then you have a negative net migration or out migration. So there are places in the world today that have net in migration. There are places in the world that have net out migration. And thinking about the characteristics of those places that makes them more of a net source regions for migrants or more of a net destination regions for migrants is an interesting question to ask and consider. There's very few places in the world that are only sending people out. There's very few places in the world that are only bringing people in. There's almost always a little bit of a two-way flow, but in some places that two-way flow is more pronounced than others. So there's places that have fairly neutral migration change, but there's people moving across a border into or out of from different regions. We keep records on almost everybody who comes into the country. In the case of the United States, if someone's coming in and they apply for asylum, or they come in and apply for a green card or on some kind of a guest worker permit, we keep track of all that. Undocumented migrants, that is people who come into a country without filing paperwork or getting the correct permission to migrate into the country, those individuals are harder to track, so we have to estimate those numbers, but those numbers are estimated as well. And so we do our very best when we're talking about a country like the United States or Canada or countries in Europe to keep track of those numbers. It's harder to estimate total number of migrants from places that have less robust record keeping and less monitored borders. So it's tougher to keep careful track of those numbers, but it's still estimated when we can see. So we'll get to some examples when you can keep that in mind, that numbers are estimates, but we do have a pretty good idea. Way back about almost 150 years ago, I guess, 1885, Ravenstein came up with these 6 laws of migration, and he made these observations in Europe. His laws of migration are interesting because almost all of them have held true today. As a matter of fact, only one is really not the case today, which is that we know today that sometimes there are more males than females in some migration flows, and most migration flows, it's about equal numbers of women and men. Most migrants, though, move a short distance. In fact, one of the things that we notice about migration is we pay a lot of attention to international migration, that is from one country to another. But most migrants actually move from one place to another within the same country. That's not as politically contentious or as big of a journey, so it doesn't draw as much attention, but that's still the truth. People move from one state to another within the United States far more often than people move from outside the United States into the United States or out of the United States. Each migration flow produces a counterflow of migrants. This one is really hard to falsify because you would need to find a migration pattern where only people were moving from one country to the other and not even one person moving back. That one person counts as a counterflow, right? But it's more generally true than that. And so what we observe is that when there are migrants moving from a place like Mexico to the United States, there's also migrants moving back from the United States to Mexico. That's a pattern called return migration, when migrants have come to a country and then maybe return home to visit family, and not like on a vacation, but actually to stay with family, to live there again. Or people might come to a country for a while to work and then return back to that country to retire. And so there's flows back and forth between the countries. Usually there's more moving one way than the other, but that's the pattern we've observed, and we see it's very generally followed. Long distance migrants tend to move to major cities. This remains true today because major cities have greater connectivity and a stronger economy than smaller cities or the countryside. Migrants sometimes would move to remote areas, to rural areas, to work in farming-related occupations, but farm labor is not in high demand anymore. We have lots of mechanization to take care of most farm jobs, not all, but most farm jobs. So most migrants today continue to move to major cities. There's also cultural reasons for that, which is it's not just that the major cities have successful economies and therefore more employment for new migrants. It's also that you're more likely in a city of 1 million or 10 million even to find somebody else who has your culture if you're from a foreign place. So they're more likely to speak your language, to show you where to buy the foods that you think of as familiar, connect you with other people who are part of your community or maybe share your faith. All these things that make you think about being home away from home are attractive to a new migrant to a place. And so that's why cities are also an attractive area. Rural residents are more migratory than those in towns. This one is a little bit tougher, but it's generally true again, especially when we look at movement from people in developing countries to to cities in the developing countries. The rural to urban migration patterns in poor countries in the world is really huge for these short migration flows. And then rural residents tend to be the ones who are easiest to, the most precarious, I should say, and sometimes are looking for the opportunity to find work either in a large city in their home country or even in a city outside their home country. And then I already mentioned this one has not been held up as much recently, but then economic factors are the main reason for migration. This remains to be true. We see sometimes natural disasters providing environmental pushes out of a place, so floods from hurricanes or forest fires or droughts. All of those natural disasters can push people out of an area, and that's important when it happens as a motivator. But most people in the world today migrate because of some combination of not having a good job where they are, or maybe no work at all, or low wages, or poor working conditions, or all of those things, and they'll move to some place where they can find better employment. That's the main reason for migration today. When we talk about global migration, we already mentioned that most migration is within the same country, but we pay more attention to international migration because it's politically contentious at times. Not everyone likes the idea of people moving from country to country. There's sometimes opposition to it. And the general pattern we see is movement from low and middle income countries to higher income countries. And what I want to do is I want to pop this cool visualization open here, and you can check this out if you want. It's a little bit of a word salad here to type it all in, but I'm sure you can freeze the screen and go to it yourself. But let's take a look at this cool visualization here. Now, the data here is only up to 2010, but you can go back in time to look at how these flows have changed, which is pretty fascinating to consider because migration is not fixed. Migration changes with both the factors that are pushing people out of a place and the factors that are pulling people into a place. I want to spend the rest of this lecture looking at these global patterns of migration with some major flows. I don't know that I'll spend every single look at every single flow here, but I'll talk about some big patterns overall. So North America here, you can see these flows. The colors of the flows tell you where people are coming from and where they're going to. You don't see a lot of the deep orange moving out of anywhere. And so if you look at the total inflows over this period into North America, and so this is just the US and Canada, the majority of these were going to the US. Canada does take a lot of migrants as a percentage, but it's a small country, so not that many migrants in terms of total. What we see is that there were about 8 million people moving in and only a little less than 2 million moving out. And so those outflows are shown here. The major outflow is this one right here from North America to Europe, 1.1 million. And then the other outflows are really quite small. So North America to Latin America, 267,000. The inflows to North America, though, are quite large. And notice that Latin America is the single biggest source. And then South Asia is important. East Asia is important. Southeast Asia is important. And we mentioned Europe already as an outflow. And then smaller numbers from Africa as well. So the populations moving from the world's largest populations in terms of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asia are really big. And then Latin America is the major flow because it is geographically proximate to North America. So that's the big pattern there. If we look at Africa, we notice a couple patterns. One is that most migration within African countries is from one country to another African country. So there's a lot of cross-border traffic within Africa. There's tons of movement within these countries, of course, too, but this is just showing us international migration. Notice there's not a lot of out-migration out of Africa to other places yet. We see a flow here from Africa to North America. We see a flow here from Africa to West Asia. So this is West Asia in this organization is considered basically what some people call the Middle East, right? But everything from Saudi Arabia up to probably Iran, right? So not Pakistan. Pakistan is part of South Asia. And then a major flow here from Africa to Europe, but then otherwise fairly small flows. So within Africa and Europe are the two major flows there. If we look at Europe, notice that again, there's the green, sorry, not blue. The green line here is from a European country to another European country. Pretty big flow, about 2 million people. That is mostly from Eastern European countries to Western and Northern European countries. But then there's also some big flows in from Africa, in from Latin America, in from South Asia, and then a little bit from North America and some other places. But those are the major flows into Europe. So from Europe to Europe, but largely from Eastern to Western, and then Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. Former Soviet Union, we see flows within the former Soviet Union countries fairly frequently, and then a little bit of movement from these former Soviet territories to Europe. Not a lot of motion that way, though, so most of it's within that sphere of influence by 2010. These numbers have probably changed a little in the 2020s, especially with, or 2010s even, but especially with the advent of war in the Ukraine, we're going to see more migrations around the former Soviet Union. We've seen lots of movement out of Russia and out of Ukraine as well. West Asia, again here, notice there's a massive influx from South Asia to West Asia. So this is largely workers coming from places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, some from India, I believe, but mostly Bangladesh and Pakistan because of the dominant religions of those areas, into places like the United Arab Emirates, into Qatar, into Saudi Arabia. These very rich, oil-rich countries bring in a ton of workers to do a lot of the jobs that the citizens of the country don't want to do, and so there's a lot of demand for that labor, and they fill that demand mostly from South Asia. Little flows from elsewhere. I'm not going to talk too much about those flows of migrants. If we look at South Asia, we already mentioned that one flow, but notice that North America and Europe are the major destinations out of South Asia besides into West Asia, and then a little bit of motion from South Asia to South Asia. East Asia, predominantly China is the biggest population here, but also Japan and the Koreas. We notice that North America and Europe are the major migration flows, not huge migrations out of East Asia, which is interesting to note because East Asia is a massive population, just like South Asia, just not as big for migration flows. Southeast Asia has a really even distribution between West Asia, North America, and Europe. And so this motion to West Asia, again, is a lot of temporary workers to the Arabian Peninsula oil states, petrostates they're sometimes called, with an emphasis on migrants from Indonesia because it's a majority Muslim population there as well. And then some North America, within Southeast Asia, there's a major migration flow. Oceania is Australia, New Zealand, and the islands off throughout the Pacific. Small movements of people because there's not a lot of people there total, but 1.4 million out total. And then last but not least, Latin America, we see the major flows are to North America and Europe, and we have gone all the way around the circle. I know that was a lot, but I hope that you actually might go and play with this a little bit to think about where people are coming from and going to. It might not be the resolution you quite want, but you can always search that information. I thought it was a really good tool for visualizing those flows of people in a way that makes sense and helps you understand some of the major flows around the world. Our book goes through them in text basis where it describes sort of each region one at a time. I found that to be a little bit hard to visualize, I guess is how I found it. And I find visualizations like this are a lot more friendly to just thinking about all these movements of people. I'm going to stop it there for right now. And when we return, we'll talk about the migration from, and actually, I'm not going to quite stop yet. I'm going to get us through to the migration flows from the U.S., but I'll stop before we get to that. Let me just keep going here a little bit here and look at these patterns. When we look at the total number of migrants, we can see there's some countries that receive a ton of people. So, for example, the United States has a huge number of foreign-born residents. So we have a long, proud history of migration into the United States. As a percentage, because the United States is a large country by population, as a percentage of the United States isn't that high, but as a total number, it's fairly high. You notice here that we've got Saudi Arabia has a huge number, and these are these guest workers, again, foreign workers, mostly from South Asia. And then Germany stands out here as well. Russia is standing out here too, and that's mostly people who have moved back into Russia from the former Soviet Union, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a large number of foreign-born because there was a return to Russia from the Soviet territories after the end of the Soviet Union. If we look at the number of people moving out of a country, it's an interesting pattern to see these places like Russia, for example, as a place that had a lot of migrants moving in, but also a lot of people moving out. And so you can see some differences here, but we notice that places like Mexico stands out as a place that's sending a lot of people out. India stands out here in terms of total number of people moving out. And then China actually has been sending more people out as well. I wonder if the visualization we just looked at would show more of an influence of East Asia if we looked at the 2010s instead of that 05 to 2010 period. I think probably migration from China has increased a little in the last decade, which is evidenced by that map. Now, net migration, so this is pulling that definition we looked at of people moving in minus people moving out. What we see here is that the blues and purples are gaining population from migration on average, and the oranges and brown, I guess, is that deepest color, are losing people on average. There's more people moving out than in. We notice a few patterns here. One is that the largest populations of East Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia are by and large out-migration regions. There's a lot of out-migration from these countries across sort of North Africa and the Sahel, but there's also places in that are adding and losing people within the sort of Central and Southern Africa region. What we're seeing here is that big migration flow from one African country to another African country. There is a migration flow from Africa to areas outside of Africa, from African countries to areas outside of Africa, but there's a lot of movement within the countries, from one country to another within Africa as well. Interestingly here too, notice that there is major movements in some of these Latin American countries here as well. Colombia, for example, saw by 2020, Colombia had gotten more peaceful. It had been quite conflict-ridden. And so in the 2020 map here, what we're seeing is a lot of people moving back to Colombia who had been displaced or had fled some of the conflict in Colombia. So sometimes we get a little snapshot like this. It doesn't tell a long-term story. It tells us a one-year story or a few years kind of story. And then if we look at the rate, this is not the absolute number, this is the rate, so the relative number of migrants per 1,000 population in the home country. We see that the United States is not as deep purple as it was because the U.S. has a larger base population. What's interesting is some countries stand out for having a large percentage of migrants. And so Canada stands out, Norway stands out, there's Germany, Australia is in there. So some countries that are a little bit random seeming, but just have more migrants moving in. Obviously, countries that have lots of people moving out have a higher out migration rate too. One of the things that stands out here for high net migration rates going out is the drivers of conflict in some of these places. So, for example, South Sudan has had a lot of political instability and civil war going on. Syria, the same. And then Venezuela has been in an economic crisis and increasing economic insecurity and political insecurity for the past few years. So those are all pushing people out. So a large proportion of the population per 1,000 total people have been moving out. That is where I'm going to end it for now. I hope that wasn't too much of a giant data download for you. I hope it was interesting to think about all these movements of people around the world. When we return, I'll talk about the 4 phases of migration to the United States. This is the migration history of the United States. Since this class is based in the U.S. and the textbook is written by U.S. authors, we focus on the migration history of the U.S. That's all for now. Again, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you all soon.